I think it gets very convoluted. I feel like history, as it's commonly thought of in this country and in our educational context, is very much tied to Western aristocratic white men's viewpoint. And that in addition to that, it's tied to, and it's very important that it's tied to the superiority of gender. It's very gender-based. So that the reflection of Indian history is incredibly different than oral history, than it would be from a traditional standpoint in terms of oral history. That the reflections of events are represented very differently, and the interpretations of those events are represented extremely differently than what's in the memory of people who have experienced the passage of history over millennia from a completely different standpoint that has to do with memory and place. So people and place represent tribal history in a very different way, and that information that's passed through families about their own family history and the family's relationship to events that took place even in the what I would still call the recent past of 100 years ago, are reflected extremely differently than they are in history books, in the journals of our friends, trappers and traders who had more positive viewpoints about tribes and the Blackfeet tribe in particular, as friends of the Indians, still came from Western European origins that made a variety of some assumptions. And I really feel like the most glaring one is about gender. So what's happened, I think, in terms of reflecting history back as we move forward with the really exciting opportunities of Indian Ed for All, is that people have started to make choices about what gets reflected and what doesn't get reflected and why. If we talk about a sort of uninterrupted evolutionary process of informing people, traditionally folks were able to access information and knowledge based on need and articulation of need, sometimes just survival, basic survival. There were very standard ways of being taught information and passing information on to the children for specific purposes, to define the role of an individual in a community, to help that individual define what their own personal, very personal contribution could be or would be to community. All of those were very well laid out ways of managing knowledge and information. But on another level, on a deeper level of spirituality, where people were committed to learning and to taking the next steps in knowing and learning from the knowledge keepers. And some of those are not necessarily individuals in the community, but spiritual helpers. Beings that weren't necessarily in the community, but could be found in in the spiritual places, in the holy places where people go to gain knowledge. Much of that information and the learning for it and the carrying on of ceremony was transferred by rite, so that the commitment to know was very much a part of it, and the commitment to understand had to be there in order for that knowledge and rite of transfer to be passed on. And in understanding what information, well, let me go a step back, because I feel like we really need to say that information and knowledge are absolutely not the same thing. That having data and information is not the same thing as knowing and understanding. And those are very much the defining places of spiritual knowledge. The knowing and the deep understanding of information in order to move forward and to be a contributor to the advancement and progression and positive evolvement of the tribal community was very much a commitment that people made at a variety of levels, men and women both, from their own standpoints and their own commitments, could make, basically pay for either an energy or obligation, responsibility, could pay for the understanding that they needed in order to take those steps that they could contribute to the community. And there are very ritualized protocols for the transfer of the rites to specific kinds of knowledge, and it very much builds on one and another. And I think what's happened a great deal in this picture is that, well, two things. As people instructors, school teachers, have tried to understand not only tribal history, but tribal information and knowing, ways of knowing, worldview, ways of being in the world. As people have tried to comprehend and understand and teach and pass that basic information on, they've either crossed lines or had to take different paths to people and information. And there hasn't been a good way of knowing what's misinformation and what's truly information. On the other hand, tribal people have had a lot of confusion about how to pass on information in a sort of unfamiliar environment or for an unfamiliar reason. That's not a traditional reason. It's been taken out of context, basically, and placed into a context of Western European educational transfer. And it becomes not only sort of watered down and meaningless, but it's the content, with the context piece being gone, it becomes a little bit more difficult to understand, both from the tribal standpoint and from, I think, the public education standpoint. And then we've had sort of tribal folks who've come into this picture, and very much of this, I think, started in Europe because of some of the European societies who've been enamored of tribal folks, wherein Native people have capitalized on information. And my feeling is that a lot of the selling of information, and that's gone on, I've heard of and actually seen some media stuff of ceremonial processes that are being sold not only in Europe but in this part of the country, and people who charge for sweats, and that's a kind of really more based fundamental concept I think that people have heard about, is the charging for sweats, but charging for ceremony. And I feel like these Native folks they're not only charlatans from the sense of a very foreign and kind of spooky to me concept of selling information, but they're also kind of laughing at people who are willing to believe that they can buy with money what has been so ritualistically and taken so seriously as tradition in the past.